Hello, I'm Jeremy School, the Chief Marketing Officer at Nasdaq. Thank you all for being here today and welcome to a discussion on the economics of the US presidential election. We have an amazing, diverse set of high caliber attendees with us today, everyone from educators to CEOs to biotech researchers, investors, and financial professionals. And our panelists aren't too shabby either. It is certainly an interesting time for us all to gather. We are facing what feels like some unique moments in our history. Market volatility, an uncertain global economy, extraordinary social tensions, and a once-in-a-lifetime health pandemic. At Nasdaq, we firmly believe it is important for us to be a convener of insightful discussions that help provide our clients with the type of intelligence that leads to opportunity. We look forward to the discussion today on all these topics, and we welcome your questions, which we'll answer at the end of each session. There will also be a replay available in the next couple of days. With that, I'd like to welcome our first host, Guy Adami, who is not only an amazing human being with a great sense of humor, he also happens to be one of my favorite on-air personalities at CNBC and one of the original Fast Money 5 on CNBC's Fast Money. Guy?
Jeremy, thanks so much. It's an honor to be here. I've loved working with the Nasdaq, and I say if all the time, but if we make it to January, Fast Money will be on the air for 14 years. And the Nasdaq's been an incredible, not only landlord, but partner in everything we're doing. And I've gotten really close with so many of the folks there. Jeremy's wonderful, and all the guys and gals behind the scenes do an amazing job. I want to thank our panelists who I'm about to introduce, but I also want to thank the audience for spending time with us. I think we had over 3,000 people register for this, which is amazing. And hopefully we'll address, answer, and create some dialogue. And we, as Jeremy mentioned, please ask all the questions you want. I'm going to be monitoring the chat along with some of the folks at the Nasdaq, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But with that, I want to introduce our panelists, and it is a great group of folks. We have Jim O'Sullivan, who's the Chief U.S. Macro Strategist at TD Securities. We have Matt Rhodes, who's the co-CEO of CGCN Group. Patty Solis-Doyle, who's a partner at Brunswick Corp. And Phil McIntosh, who's the chief economist at the Nasdaq. Really a great panel, and I want to get started. You know, before we got on air, I asked the panelists some questions, and I asked Patty, how many people have voted already? I thought the number was either side of 70 million, and she said by the end of today, 85 million fellow citizens will have voted in this election, which I find to be a staggering number. So Patty, and I love your work on CNN, by the way, can you speak to what that number, what 85 million means in the context of where we've been before, understanding that this is a much different year, and what it suggests in terms of this election?
Yeah, sure. First, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. That's a staggering number. You know, we are currently at around 78 million people voting. We're averaging anywhere between 7 and 10 million a day. So yes, by the end of the day, I think we're going to get to 85 million people who have already voted. What does that say? We have already way surpassed what the early vote was in 2016. And we are probably at 2/3 of the total vote by the end of the day today of the total vote of 2016. So turnout is huge. The reason early vote and mail-in ballots have surged so much since in prior years is obviously the pandemic. But what is important to note is about 11 million more Democrats have requested mail-in ballots than Republicans. So not only are we going to see a huge turnout overall, which every model that I've seen in this election cycle, a huge voter turnout favors Democrats, particularly in these battleground states that are racially diverse. But also, we may very well see a scenario where Republicans, because they're more likely to vote the day of rather than in early voting or in mail-in ballots, we may see a scenario where President Trump is ahead in a state like Pennsylvania that could be determinative, but once all the votes are counted, it could go to Biden, and that could cause some, chaos, a little bit of havoc.
And that, Patty, speaks to, in my world and Phil's and Jim's world, something we call market volatility, which we're going to touch on, by the way. So havoc is one way to put it. Volatility is another way to put it. Matt, you heard what Patty said. I know you have some thoughts on this, who it favors, But look, 2016, I'm sure there are a lot of people shaking their head right now in the audience saying, well, polls suggested something in 2016 that didn't come to fruition. And, maybe we're seeing a replay of that. How do you interpret these numbers? I want you to sort of read the tea leaves that you're looking at.
Sure. Well, first off, thanks for having me, Guy. It's an honor to be here. Patty threw out a lot of numbers there. And, if you're a Republican, those numbers are pretty alarming. And so I thought I'd go through some of the absentee early voting numbers and kind of put it in perspective, because if you're a Republican and you wake up in the morning and you look at some of these numbers coming in, you want to spit out your coffee. So first off, if you look at one of the key battleground states, and I think the real key battleground state at the presidential level for folks to pay attention to is North Carolina. And I pulled some of the absentee early voting data that Patty's referring to, and both parties have access to this. So you have to remember, each party is like big brother. Like, we know when you voted, we know when you've been naughty or nice. And so we track all this absentee data. And in the beginning, it was crushing in a state like North Carolina, especially for Republicans. The numbers were 47% Democrat absentee ballot requests to only 19 Republican. But what you're starting to see is finally this gap closing. And the last time I checked the absentee gap, now the number of early votes and absentee ballots submitted in North Carolina is 41% Democrat, 28 Republican, which is good news. And why it's good news is two reasons. One reason, and Patty talked about this a little bit, Democrats are they cannibalize a lot of their vote early. So they've pushed a lot of their people, chased a lot of absentee ballot requests. And for whatever reason, Republicans in most parts of the country, and we could get a shrink on here and maybe they could explain it, we love to vote on election day. I don't know if it's because we get that little sticker and we go to our office or school or whatever, but Republicans come out on election day. So there's a huge opportunity, especially in these battleground states, to make up numbers in the close. So Patty's exactly right there.
So I mean, I think it's safe to say, suggesting, listening to what Matt just said and Patty, what you said, that unless there's some outcome that I don't think anybody foresees, we're not going to know who the next president of the United States is when we wake up on November 4th. Patty, is that accurate?
Well, so that brings me to what is a very, very narrow path for President Trump. It's not impossible, and we saw him do it before, pull an inside straight in 2016, but he's going to have to do it again this time around. So there's 6 toss-up states that Donald Trump won really fairly handedly in 2016, and he's going to have to win them all this time around, plus pick up a couple of Dem-leaning states like Pennsylvania or an Arizona or a Nevada. And so he's going to have to win Florida, Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, Iowa. He's going to have to win all of them. So if on November 3rd he loses one of those, we're pretty much going to know that he has lost. We're still going to wait for some of these results in places like Pennsylvania, who can't start counting until November 3rd, who can't really start processing until November 3rd. That's the case in Michigan, and that's the case in Wisconsin. But if he loses those sort of must-win states for him, we'll know. We'll know on November 3rd.
And we're going to come back to that because I think it's fascinating. But I want to sort of drill down the economics of all this. And Phil, I want to sort of go to you. Phil, it's a fascinating years in terms of the numbers, GDP numbers we're seeing, and the unemployment numbers. These, if you had said a year ago that we're going to see numbers with these type of handles, and in my word, a handle is basically the 2, 3 in front of unemployment, or the 23% negative GDP that we've seen, numbers like that, you would have said you're out of your mind. But here we are, we're seeing numbers that nobody could have foreseen. What is this next president, regardless of who it is, what are they inheriting in terms of the US economy right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think they're going to inherit the coronavirus first and foremost. And that's one of the things that everyone's been talking about, the huge amounts of government debt, all the fiscal stimulus. That's something to worry about for the future. But I think in the short term, they're going to inherit coronavirus. By the looks of the data coming through this week, we potentially will be like Europe with a spike in cases and new shutdowns and another shrinkage, a second dip in the recession. And so I think they're going to have to worry about getting the economy started and also getting people healthy. We're going to have to try and change behaviors. If coronavirus doesn't see a vaccine in the short term, we're definitely going to have to start getting people wearing masks. It's been proven to reduce the spread of coronavirus, and that's going to be a cultural shift for a lot of people as well. So I think it's going to be a challenge. The first thing they're going to have to tackle is coronavirus and the stimulus, but that creates a whole lot of other economic stresses a year or three down the track with a huge amount of debt that's somehow going to have to be paid off as well.
And I want to come back to that at some point, but Jim, now I want to go to you. And your title is Chief Macro Strategist, and this is a loaded question, I know, but how difficult in this world is it to be a macro strategist, given the data changes every day? I mean, Phil just spoke to this, but you're seeing now Europe's effectively shutting down, apparently for the second time. The numbers we're seeing here in the United States, I heard Dr. Scott Gottlieb on this morning, and he thinks we could be seeing up to 100,000 new cases somewhere between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I mean, that's a staggering amount of data to try to jam into macro forecasts. What are you looking at? How difficult it is to do your job? I know the answer to that. And what are some of your forecasts going forward in terms of not only the U.S. economy, but sort of the global thing, which, by the way, they're all hand in hand at this point?
Yes, and hi Guy, hi everybody. Well, in terms of new COVID cases, they were already back up to 70, 80,000 per day. So the numbers are up there. And this is essentially the third wave in the US. I mean, we're kind of getting the second wave, I guess, as it were, in Europe at this point. I mean, in terms of the outlook generally, there's huge uncertainty. A, COVID, I mean, where do we go with COVID? And B, you have the election and fiscal policy. I'd say between the two of those, there's a lot of uncertainty there. I mean, in terms of where we stand right now, before we even get into that uncertainty, I mean, obviously we did get that very strong GDP number this morning, up 33% at an annual rate. It's a record number. So Trump is right, certainly when he says that we're having a record recovery. Obviously 30% plus GDP, we're up 11 million plus on jobs in 5 months. The problem, of course, is that follows an even more record plunge, and it looks like momentum is slowing. And that's partly because of the latest COVID wave, and partly because fiscal stimulus is starting to fade. I mean, a lot of the strength that we did see over the last few months has been with the help of enormous fiscal stimulus. But absent new legislation, that drag starts fading and arguably that stimulus starts fading and starts turning into a drag on a quarter-to-quarter basis. So, I mean, the net of this is, I mean, right now you look at this morning's GDP report, and it's a lot better than it looked in the second quarter, but we're still down 3.5% from the end of last year. Now, it was down 10% as of the second quarter. These are non-annualized numbers. And so you're down 3.5%, which is comparable to the pretty severe 2008-2009 recession. That was pretty severe. That was a 4% peak to trough decline. Now, if you look at employment, it's a lot worse than that. Again, GDP right now is down 3.5% from the peak. If you look at employment, it's down about 7%. So this has been much harder on employment than GDP. And that reflects the fact that this recession has disproportionately hurt low-income people, low-income jobs, low productivity jobs. So the labor market is in a much worse situation than if you look at GDP. Now, going forward, I mean, our forecast is that we do grow from here. It remains positive. So we've got 3 to 3.5% growth over the next year. But I have to say, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. Europe is looking like a double dip at this stage. The US numbers aren't going there at this point. It doesn't look like there's an appetite for widespread shutdowns again in the US. But that could change, obviously, if the COVID numbers keep going up. And it also assumes that we do get another round of fiscal stimulus before too long. But again, yes, there is huge uncertainty here.
So Matt, you heard what Jim just said, and it's interesting. And I'm trying to play this as straight down the middle as possible as I possibly can. And I understand how different comments can be taken as partisan, and they're not meant to be. But listen, President Trump can absolutely continue to run on this economy, given the backdrop of what's taken place over the last 8 months, effectively not being the fault of this administration in terms of the virus and what we needed to do to our economy. And last year, things were chugging along. And despite this move of the last few days in the US stock market, I mean, you're talking about both a Nasdaq and a Dow Jones Industrial Average that seemingly was making new highs every single day. The president absolutely talks about that, rightly so. Can he continue to lever that? And is that enough, in your view, to get him reelected on Tuesday?
He needs to, and that's what he was able to do in the second debate. He wasn't able to do it in the first debate, Guy. Look, this race stopped becoming a choice and was a referendum on the president and the referendum on his handling of COVID. But when he's talking about what the economy was and what the economy could be in his second term, and that he's the right person to get us out of this economic malaise, then that's a good day for him. And so when he's out on the campaign trail doing that, that's an effective day of campaigning. But this race stopped being a choice and became a referendum. And you can see it. One of the most jarring numbers I look at in the polling data is Vice President Joe Biden's fave, unfave. Like the president's fave, unfave, his fave's at about 44%. And to be honest, if you take that nationally and apply it to battleground states, he can win with that. And we could probably have a Republican Senate. But right now, Joe Biden's fave is about 52%, and his unfave is only 44%. And that means we haven't effectively made this race a choice. And to put that in perspective, when the president shocked the world and many pollsters in 2016, in some of these battleground states where the president beat Hillary Clinton, her unfave was almost 60%. And so unfortunately, this race got away from being a choice. In the stretch run here, I feel some tightening in some of these battlegrounds, in part because he's laying out the argument that you just said, Guy. I totally agree.
Patty, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I surprisingly, I agree. I think were it not for this pandemic and the sort of cascade of effects it has had on our daily lives, not just in terms of the economy, but our healthcare, education, all of that. I do think that Donald Trump was on a path to victory prior to this pandemic. What has been surprising to me is the steadiness, however, since the pandemic on this race. Since March, since Joe Biden was the presumed nominee, it has been a really sort of steady, consistent race in that Joe Biden was leading nationally anywhere between 7 and 10 points. Not the pandemic, not a recession, not high unemployment, not a vacancy on the Supreme Court has really impacted this race. And I find that remarkable. What does it mean? I compare it to 2016 in that it was volatile all the way through the general election. And I think it has something to do with the fact that we had two very unlikable candidates. It pains me to say that because I worked for Hillary Clinton for almost 18 years. But we had two very unlikable candidates. And as you mentioned, this time around, we only have one candidate who's underwater in terms of favorability. So again, these are all metrics that point to a Dem victory on Tuesday.
So Phil, some of the questions coming in, and I want to direct this one at you. And this might have seemed obvious. I don't know what obvious is in today's world, but who's the better candidate for business? Who gets elected and is more business friendly in January of 2021, Phil?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, especially because the coronavirus itself is going to be the main thing that they're going to have to tackle. And there's a bunch of research that shows that actually tackling coronavirus aggressively has a better longer term effect on the economy because people can get back to work faster. I mean, look at the dispersion now between goods and services spending. We've got goods spending is actually above coronavirus levels, which is obviously something you can do quite safely with coronavirus. Goods aren't going to give you coronavirus, but services, the leisure industry, the travel industry, restaurants, which employ so many people, are really underwater because nobody wants to go and be that close to someone that's a stranger. And so just the fact that we've got coronavirus makes it really difficult to get that part of the economy going again. That's part of the 10 million people who are still unemployed. And so I think, tackling coronavirus itself is part of the problem. But longer term, it's going to be about getting the budget under control and then worrying about how we pay back some of this government debt. We've got wartime levels of government debt. And a lot of people on the conferences that I'm talking through are asking about inflation. They're asking about paying back the debt. And I think that's going to be a challenge for the administration while they're still trying to get us to grow back out of this recession.
And Phil, I'm going to come right back to that, but Jim, I want to ask you the same question. In your estimation, given everything we've learned, given everything both candidates have said and the platforms they're running on, who's better for business in January of 2021 and then for the next 4 years going forward?
Yeah, I'd say there's no clear right or wrong answer on that. I mean, it's partly ideological, I think, how people would answer that. And there's also long-term versus short-term. I mean, if I could just lay it out a little bit, maybe, without necessarily giving an answer. I mean, certainly on the negative side for Biden in terms of business, I mean, there are parts of his agenda that are clearly less favorable for business. I mean, the corporate tax rate obviously would go up again to 28%. And certainly for the stock market, he's proposing, at least as part of the agenda, to tax capital gains for people making more than $1 million per year at a regular rate of income instead of at a special rate. So that's a huge increase in capital gains taxes for people, a lot of who are getting the capital gains out there in the first place. So that's clearly a negative. Obviously, there will be more regulation under Biden as well. I mean, I think that's particularly true for the energy industry. And again, there are a lot of arguments for that from a climate perspective, but clearly from a pure business perspective, it's negative for the energy sector. I mean, even if he's not banning fracking and healthcare. So I think there are a lot of aspects of the Biden agenda which can be argued are much less pro-business than we've been used to under Trump. Now, on the other side, of course, COVID matters a lot in terms of the overall economic environment. And I think most people would say that the president has lost credibility in terms of COVID management. And it's also true that a big problem for business in the last couple of years with the Trump administration has been the constant trade wars. And I think the expectation is that we're not going to have those sort of trade wars under Biden, that those trade wars were only negative. That was the biggest negative for the equity market over the last couple of years that ultimately we survived. So again, there are arguments on both sides. I mean, I would also say that in terms of the year ahead, in terms of economic activity, we're more likely to get more stimulus if it's Biden and it's Trump. Although I'll also add that the Senate is very important here. We haven't talked about that yet. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the race for presidency, and I'm inclined to agree with Patty that even if you give North Carolina to Trump and Georgia and Iowa and Florida and Ohio and Texas, he still has to get Arizona and Pennsylvania at least, and it's a lot. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's unlikely. But the Senate, I think, is key. I mean, right now, betting markets would say that the Senate is going to flip back to Democrats. Right now, it's effectively 53-47 for Republicans when you count like Bernie Sanders, the independents who vote as a Democrat. And the betting markets would say that's going to go to 51-52 Democrat to 48-49. And I think a lot of people feel that a small, narrow majority for Democrats maybe would mean that you get broadly the platform, but not the extremities. You start getting 54-55 for Democrats, and maybe it's a little more concerning. So I think market reaction could depend as much on what happens in the Senate, frankly, as much as happens in the White House. And we actually may not have the result of that on Wednesday morning either. I'll stop there.
Patty?
After that, yeah, I think that's so important in terms of what happens on the down ballot races. I don't think we should just be focusing what happens on the presidential level. Look, I think this time around, both parties have been extremely disciplined. And that's saying a lot for my party, the Democratic Party, because we are not so. But in terms of the left wing of the party and the more moderate New Dems wing of the party, we have been consistent in that our North Star is beating Trump. And so we haven't been rocking the boat much. But please expect that to end the minute if and when Joe Biden is elected president. You're going to see some tensions between inside the party from the far left and with moderates, and you'll see it manifest itself, first and foremost during the transition and appointments and influence on the transition. But you're going to see the bigger the win if Democrats take back the Senate. And some Democrats I talk to who are feeling bullish on the House, even if we pick up 8, 10, 12 seats in the House, the bigger the win for Democrats, the more pressure there's going to be on a Biden administration to move to the left. And I think that's something that the business community especially needs to watch out for.
Matt, I know you have some thoughts on this as well in terms of the how things break down, what's most favorable for the economy, and how you see this whole thing breaking down a week or so from now?
Yeah, first on the Senate and on the election as a whole, I think everyone should just brace themselves and prepare, whether or not we know what happens at the presidential level, whether we're counting absentee ballots in places like Arizona for a week or whatever. The election's not going to end because in Georgia, we have 2 Senate races and they have the crazy jungle primary process where if a candidate in a race doesn't get 50%, then it goes to a runoff. And I think there will definitely be at least 1 runoff, maybe even 2 runoffs. So our perpetual election will continue until January 6th, where we'll spend millions of more dollars to try to figure out who actually is in control of the Senate. And I look at these Senate races right now, and one of the big challenges we've had is when you have a great cycle like we did in 2014, that means 6 years later, you've got a lot of seats to defend. And every time that this race has become a referendum on the president's handling of COVID, it's not only hurt his numbers in battleground states, but it hurts the Republican candidates in places like North Carolina and Arizona, and even in places like Montana. And so right now, I think the Senate is so close. I would love to say that Mitch McConnell will be the majority leader for sure, but I have it right around 49 right now with 2 runoffs that ultimately could decide whether or not we have a Democrat majority in the Senate. But a lot of them are tightening. There's so many races tightening. The problem for Republicans right now is there are states where we have competitive Senate races like Montana, Kansas, South Carolina. It makes me want to vomit that I have to admit that those are competitive races. And that's the challenge we face right now, the map and the competitive nature of some of these races that shouldn't be.
Yeah, and I think our audience understands that, there's obviously very strong views in terms of, sides of the aisle that some of our panelists have, and that's what makes a good debate. And I'm obviously now speaking about Matt and Patty, and that's why we have both Matt and Patty on. So I just want our audience to understand that, and that again makes for this very interesting conversation. But Phil, we have a question from Jim in our audience, and I think this is a really interesting question. I'm going to ask this to Jim as well. But Jim asks, if Biden were to win this, don't you think that GOPers will make every attempt to curtail, halt stimulus efforts? I think, that's a fair question given the backdrop of what we've seen over the last few months, Phil.
Yeah, and I think definitely in the short term, like if you've got a sort of lame duck period in between November and February, what's the incentive for the Senate to actually approve any of what the Democrats want to get done? So I think the market yesterday and the last couple of days has sold off a lot because we've realized the stimulus is not coming anytime soon. And I think there's definitely a risk that the stimulus really won't get done until we have the new Senate, the new House, the new president in place and everything ready to go. And so that's a risk. I mean, we got a bit lucky because the stimulus was so big, it caused a lot of actual savings because there wasn't as much to spend the money on. And at the moment, people look like they're working down their savings, and that's kind of helping the economy to sort of muddle through. But I think if we do have to wait another 3 months, it could put a lot of pressure on the economy. If we look at the uptick lately in the longer term unemployed, it's starting to become a bit worrying, and that they might not have jobs to go back to. The businesses might be shut for good. And that means you're going to have a lot more trouble re-stimulating the economy. You're not just bringing people back from furlough. You're going to have to get new businesses to start back up, rehire new people, have new customers. And that's a much bigger risk longer term for the economy.
Jim, is that a concern in terms of, that so much hinges on this second round of stimulus? Is it a concern that if candidate Biden were to win, the GOP, the Republican Party, would try to curtail, for whatever reason, and again, I'm trying to stay as apolitical as possible, but try to curtail a stimulus bill? And I'm asking that in the context of a question from one of our audience members.
Yeah, and I would distinguish between stimulus and more the kind of, which is more about the next 4 months, as it were, and the kind of 4-year plan broadly. I mean, when you look at the Biden agenda in terms of what's on his website, et cetera, that's not so much about near-term stimulus. It's about the 4-year plan, and even he's got 10-year numbers in terms of spending projections, et cetera. And so I would distinguish between those. And I think certainly the Republicans will be fighting very much on the four-year plan, absolutely. And they'll want to have their own imprint on that. Stimulus, there's a lot of negotiation there for sure. I mean, I think there is broad agreement in Congress that we do need more stimulus. I mean, even the Republicans in the Senate were proposing something close to $1 trillion of spending. Of course, the administration led by Mnuchin's in negotiations got up to 1.9 trillion. And the House Democrats, of course, passed a 3.5 trillion package. Then they repassed another one of 2.4 trillion. And supposedly in negotiations, Nancy Pelosi's down to 2.2. But of course, Republicans in the Senate are not on board with that. And right now they're in the majority. I mean, I think after the election, I think there's certainly room for compromise there to some extent. I mean, I think you can certainly get a $1.5 trillion package through. I mean, you don't necessarily need a majority of Republicans. And Mitch McConnell did indicate that at some point he's willing to put a vote on the floor. And of course, with the filibuster rules, you basically need 60 votes. So if you've even in the lame duck session, potentially, if you've got 47 Democrats and you pick up 13 Republicans, now I don't think probably that's going to happen in the lame duck, but as you get into the new year, then I think you can get enough Republicans to agree to some fiscal stimulus, not necessarily a $3 trillion package, but I think there is broad agreement that we do need another round of unemployment benefits extensions. And state and local governments do need some help. I mean, there's a question of how much is exactly. So there is compromise there, but I'd be shocked if there's not a stimulus package of some sort in the next few months.
You know, Phil, you spoke about inflation, and I'm glad you used that word because obviously that's something that the Fed has talked about, and we've had probably the most accommodative Federal Reserve in our history. Again, you know, politics aside, for better or for worse, here we are. And you talked about, you know, how we work our way through, you know, the debt that we've accumulated. Inflation is a fascinating thing, and this is just my personal view. You know, I think we have inflation in all the wrong places. You know, we have asset price inflation, we have inflation, and we have food inflation, to a certain extent education. It's there on the edges, but it's not really measured. Is there a potential problem with runaway inflation, not in the next 6 months, but over the next few years?
I mean, that's the question everybody would love to know the answer to, isn't it? And in reality, we've had such a huge increase in the money supply. What's stopped that from creating classic inflation is that the money velocity has slowed right down as everybody is saved for the future because there's nothing to spend money on. So we're in this kind of weird scenario where if you look at classic economic theory, we should have inflation. We should have runaway inflation. There's way too much money for the amount of goods out there to be bought. And so the only way to fix that is for prices to increase into that space. But we don't, and we've got a lack of demand going forward. If we have a second wave of coronavirus, that lack of demand is going to be even worse. And so that's one of the things that people are still talking about, holding inflation back. Without the demand, why would the prices go up? We still have a lot of unemployment, quite aside from the global trade arguments for inflation being held back. And that's sort of an interesting aspect too. In the past, we've talked about the fact that we've imported deflation, and that speaks to your argument about where the deflation has happened is in electronics goods and the sorts of things that we're not counting maybe as much because we can produce them overseas cheaper and bring them in. And that's helped keep inflation down while healthcare and education has actually been increasing in price. Potentially, as we sort of move forward into a more protectionist global environment, and we've definitely seen that start to happen even before the trade wars, we could start to see global trade decreasing. Global trade has sort of fallen off a cliff with coronavirus, although our imports are now picking up. But potentially, the global trade aspect, the lack of demand will help hold off inflation. And really, we just don't know what's going to happen in the next sort of 6 to 12 months. When we get a vaccine, will that release all of these pent-up savings? Will people be going on holidays? Will the hotels find they can charge a whole lot more than they used to? And will we have a whole lot of inflation, runaway inflation? Or is the demand still going to be latently just not strong enough to push the prices up?
And I apologize for my dog barking, folks. That's 2020 in a nutshell. But Jim, I want to sort of go to you. Same question. Inflation, concern, not a concern. You know, I would submit probably correctly that technology historically is the greatest deflationary force that's out there. And obviously the technology era that we found over the last 7 months specifically has been unprecedented. So You have the deflationary forces of technology against, to Phil's point, the inflationary forces of a very accommodative Federal Reserve. How does it all shake out in your opinion?
Not a concern, I would say. And I think the Fed is right to be as aggressive as it's being right now. And the reason they're being aggressive is because inflation is so low and is likely to stay so low. I mean, they've got a 2% goal for inflation, and they don't have the stock market obviously in that inflation number or home prices. And you could debate that, but I think most around the world, I think most central bankers would agree that it's more this goods and services inflation that you should be targeting. And right now in the GDP report, I mean, the core PCE number, the underlying trend number really that they focus on, was 1.4% year over year. They've got a 2% goal. They've been running below that for several years. And now they're after embracing average inflation targeting, where they actually want to run a little bit above 2% for a while. Now, is it possible down the road, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, they allow it to go a little over 2% and it gets out of control at some point? I mean, that's possible down the road and they'll have to deal with that then. But certainly for the next 2 or 3 years, I would say the economy is still net weak enough that there's just not going to be the inflation there. And I don't think it's about money supply or the budget deficit. I mean, yes, certainly MV equals PT. We all learned that in Econ 101. But as Phil touched on, when M goes up like this, you tend to see the V plunge. I mean, it's a tautology, really, that calculation. I mean, ultimately, I do think the amount of slack in the economy matters. There's been a lot of debate about the role of slack and the Phillips curve and Nairo and all that. But I don't think there's any question that when you've got an unemployment rate, which arguably is still in double digits, if you allow for the drop in the participation rate over the last couple of months. I mean, it's 7.9% is the actual number. But if you allow for the drop in the participation rate since earlier this year, a lot of people haven't been actively looking because of COVID. The number's really like 11%. And I do think that is disinflationary. So the question then becomes, how fast a recovery do we get? Now, with the help of all this stimulus, if you were to tell me that the unemployment rate is going to be back down to 4% by the end of 2021, then that's a different story. But I think it's going to be a long grind to get unemployment back before it's 5% or so. It's going to take several years. And in the meantime, I think that's highly disinflationary. And so, no, I'm not worried about inflation for the next couple of years. I mean, 5 years out, I mean, that could be a different story, but for now, absolutely not.
So Patty, I want to ask you this question, and Matt, right now, I believe our economy, the US economy, is 73% driven by the consumer. Consumer spending is a consumer-based economy, and it sort of is what it is. In the pathway you see forward and in your vision, what should that economy look like over the next 4 years? Should that 73% stay stagnant? Should it change to a different breakdown? What do you see going forward as the US economy in terms of percentages of manufacturing as opposed to consumer? What's best case scenario for you?
Well, I would defer that to my other esteemed panelists, but look, just from the perspective of a Biden presidency versus a Trump presidency, whoever wins, they're going to be looking at multiple crises on multiple fronts, as we all know, and the first and foremost is getting economic recovery from this pandemic, getting the vaccine, opening the country slowly, responsibly, et cetera, getting people back to work, all of that stuff, and then invest in a huge stimulus package. But I don't think we can even begin until at least the first quarter of the next year to be thinking along those terms. The priorities for a Biden administration, as we have laid out, I think he's going to go big on a big stimulus package, which will help consumers, obviously, but not so much on the manufacturing end. I can't really.
Matt, I'm sorry, Pat, but Matt, your thoughts on that again? This is just my opinion. I think we have to move from this consumer-based economy into something different. What different is, I don't know. What's your thoughts in terms of the next 4 years?
Well, look, Patty and I have agreed on a lot so far, and this is probably where we'll disagree, hopefully respectfully. The numbers that you're talking about and the trends that you're talking about is what has created this populism that exists in both parties. And, Mitt and I dealt with this when I ran his campaign in 2012. It was a lot harder for Mitt Romney to win the Republican nomination for president than anybody wanted him to give credit back then, which is fine, but it's a reality. And I think I have much stronger views about what's going on in the Democrat Party. And I do it more from my experience dealing with populism on the Republican side. And I look at what's going on, and I see those numbers that you're talking about. I see a slow recovery, and I see these progressive forces becoming even stronger, even more rebellious. They already picked off some long-term members, people like Lacey Clay, a Democrat from Missouri who has been in the House forever, was knocked out in a primary. The progressive wing of the party, the Warrens, the Sanders, the AOC, are just going to become more and more powerful and stronger and influential within the party. And this is where I have big concerns if the vice president is elected, and Patty might disagree, but I just don't think he has the energy. I don't think he'll have the mandate, even within his own party, to hold back some of the forces that exist in his party. And I'm not reading RNC talking points. This is what you see when you get outside the New York Cities, the Washington, D.C.s, where I'm sitting right now, and you start campaigning in real primary states. And that's why some of this agenda, like how is he going to stop some version of a new Green Deal? What's going to happen on the filibuster? Does he have the political capital to really stand up to people in his own party? I look at some of the things he's talking about now. He had to give an answer on this Supreme Court packing issue. His solution is a bipartisan commission. First off, Guy, I don't know what Republican in the world is going to sign up to be on a bipartisan commission to sign off on a plan to let Joe Biden pack the court. Like, I don't know if he'll be successful in that. FDR wasn't in his prime. I don't think Joe Biden can now in the back nine. But I have real concerns with these numbers that you talk about and the slow recovery and the impact it's going to have on the populist progressive movement in the Democrat Party. It really scares me.
Patty, I know you have thoughts.
I think I talked about this earlier, and we saw this throughout the primary season, 18 months ago when we had 26 people running on the Democratic side, the most diverse in history, and a lot of liberals, far left people running, and they lost. And I think if you looked at the polls during that period of time, again, the North Star for Democrats was beating Donald Trump. And it wasn't, our Democratic voters weren't driven by ideology or by any specific policy issue, but by that North Star of beating Donald Trump. And I think that's one of the big reasons that Joe Biden ended up winning the nomination. He is a moderate Democrat. He is a pragmatist. He is someone who touts the ability to be able to work across party lines. He is someone who touts the ability to compromise and negotiate. That's who we nominated. That's who's on the ticket. I don't deny that there's going to be huge tension should there be a Democratic win, both in the Congress and at the executive level. But the head of the party is not, Bernie Sanders.
So, Phil, I want to ask you this question. I want to get back to sort of the economics of this conversation. Regardless of who wins, we've seen over the last 15 or 20 years a very slow decline in the US dollar. And what I find fascinating is that, we've had the talking points historically have been strong dollar policy coming from the top of whatever administration is. And President Trump's the first president, again, my opinion, that's actually sort of pushed back on that a little bit. And, there's probably a lot of truth in what he says. So I'll ask you this. Is a strong dollar a good thing for the US economy or a bad thing, Phil, in your opinion?
I mean, there's obviously pros and cons. A strong dollar creates winners and losers. It makes it much harder to have an export-driven economy because things we're producing here are pretty expensive for anyone else anywhere in the world. But it makes it easy for us to buy things that we want to put into inputs in the products that we're making. It makes it much cheaper for us to go overseas. So it has pros and cons. But I think in reality, having a dollar that's more flexible allows the economy to adjust to the relative speed of other economies in the world. And if we look at the other economies in the world, I mean, Europe has been much worse hit by coronavirus. Its economy was already much slower than ours. Its interest rates are negative. Even if you wanted to soften the US dollar significantly, the fact that we still have positive yields, and we have a pretty strong economy, we have a very strong stock market, we have really strong business here, it actually speaks to the fact that the US economy is worthy of a relatively strong position versus other countries.
And Jim, I'm going to ask you this, and you mentioned, and again, you said inflation wasn't a concern, and you're probably correct, you're justified in that view. My pushback would be, and I'd like to just hear your response, my pushback would be, a weaker dollar by definition is inflationary, because as the dollar goes lower, your buying power diminishes. So that in and of itself is inflationary. And to a certain extent, that's been created by an extraordinarily accommodative Federal Reserve. So again, my question to you is the same as I asked Phil. You know, where do you come down on the dollar conversation? You know, what should we be looking for here in the next 4 years, I guess, regardless of who emerges victorious?
Yeah, I mean, well, the dollar, I mean, it's had its ups and downs, but it's more or less flat in the past year. I mean, I don't think it's, I mean, certainly on a trade-weighted average basis, it really hasn't changed all that much. I mean, it tends to, I mean, sometimes go up and down based on the risk environment as well. And in a world of turmoil, often the dollar is the safe haven, and it tends to go up. So that happened, I mean, during the COVID episode initially, the first round of the crisis. And a lot of that's been reversed as the economy has rebounded since then, and people are not quite as worried about a Great Depression as they were a few months ago. So the net of all this is really not a lot of change in the dollar. I mean, certainly other things equal, as the dollar goes up or down, then that makes imports or cheaper or more expensive. But of course, only a little over 10% of the economy is imports. I mean, 13 or 14% of the economy is imports. And over the years, the amount of pass-through, as it's called, from exchange rate into inflation is pretty small. So frankly, even if you get a 10% move in the dollar, it's worth maybe 0.2 percentage point for the inflation numbers over the next year. I mean, it hasn't been a huge driver of inflation one way or the other. I mean, certainly on the margin, it's a little bit, but again, I don't think it's a big driver of inflation. And yeah, I'm not anticipating a huge move one way or the other in the dollar. I mean, frankly, if the dollar is up or down 5%, it's not going to make, I think, a huge difference from a macro perspective.
Fair enough. Matt, I'm going to ask this. This is a question from one of your audience members. It's hard to deny the chasm that seems to continue to grow in terms of income inequality. How do you address that over the next 4 years through your political lens? Let's put it that way.
Well, that's a great question, and that goes back to what has happened, going back, beginning in about 2007, and then obviously the economic collapse of 2008 just created all this populism that exists in different variations in both parties. As far as what can turn it around, I think that when we create enough economic growth, and this is what I think the president, you were talking about this guy, what he was succeeding at was he was starting to grow the economy, not just inside major metropolitan areas, but people were starting to feel it. They were starting to feel it out in middle America. And we talk about some of the trade battles that, impact the economy negatively, and I don't agree with all of them, but it gave hope to a lot of folks that he was fighting for them and taking on nation states like China, who, I think we forget how much people put blame on countries like China and the impact that they've had on the day-to-day lives and pocketbook issues of Americans who live all across the country. So getting this economy back growing, making it grow not just for people who invest on Wall Street, but in the real economy, which I was pretty frightened when I heard some of Jim's numbers, and I'm not debating them, but it would only foment some of this anger and resentment that occurs out there. But I can't explain any more than I have before, just like the disconnect. When you go out there and you know, the best part of working on a presidential campaign is getting the hell out of Washington, or, you know, our headquarters was in Boston, and going out to real America and talking to people about what they're really talking about. And you know, like, I have some friends that are running for Congress. One of my friends is running in the T of Pennsylvania, right in the center of the state. And I always ask them, what are people actually asking you about? And it's never the topics that we're all screaming at each other about on cable TV. It usually comes down to economic issues, and whether they feel like, you know, they're still being left behind, or whether or not they're being listened to. And there's been this whole disconnect, especially with Washington, D.C. and the rest of the country, where people just don't feel like they've been listened to or cared about.
Patty, again, income, you know, it's absolutely an issue. I mean, there's no getting around it. It's seemingly, you know, the wealthier seem to be getting wealthier vis-a-vis stock market and certain things. And on the flip side of that, you know what's going on. How do we address that? You know, again, through your lens, how is that addressed?
Yeah, well, so let me answer it, I guess, through the lens of the Democratic Party, which I am a member of. And, you know, and it's encapsulated actually in the Biden Build Back Better, which is, you know, lowering taxes for middle America, raising taxes for people who make over 400 grand a year, you know, investing in workers' rights, like raising the minimum wage, investing in job creation through infrastructure, through green jobs. So through that platform is really focusing the economic prism and how you look at it through middle-class Americans, white working-class Americans, which was a pivotal moment in terms of the election in 2016, which is really how Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton. When you look, you know, when you look at it, and Joe Biden has been able to sort of take back some of those voters away from Donald Trump, and you see that in the numbers, and you see it in a lot of these polls that with white working class Americans, Joe Biden is really having some impact with them and pulling some of those voters away from Donald Trump on that agenda.
Phil, you have to be politically agnostic. I totally get it. But you also have to make forecasts based on outcomes. So, you know, under a President Trump reelection win, what is that outcome in terms of your forecast? And conversely, if candidate Biden were to win, you know, what are your forecasts? Are they very different, or are they surprisingly very similar?
I mean, I think it's going to depend significantly what sector you're in. So one of the interesting things we just looked at was in the 2016 election, well, the correlations of different sectors got really consistent right before the election. But when we had that surprise result that no one expected Trump to win, the next day we had sectors that were going to benefit exploding up, other sectors underperforming. So financials and energy did really well over that next week and few months. So, you know, I think, you know, you've heard Patty talk about some of the policies. We've already seen some of the ESG ETFs and some of the solar and environmental funds outperforming as Biden's odds have firmed. So you can see the different policies are going to have different outcomes across the spectrum of stocks and sectors. So I think, yeah, the bigger picture macro, we keep talking about it. It's going to be driven by the coronavirus. It's going to be driven by the stimulus and potential inflation and how we deal with that. But in the short term, lots of companies are going to be winners and lots of companies are going to be losers, but there's going to be dispersion across that depending who wins. So obviously with the Trump win, I think we're going to see more of the trade wars. We're probably going to see lower taxes for corporates. With a Biden win, we're going to see so probably more favorable for all the environmental and so the Green New Deal companies are going to be beneficiaries. Healthcare, kind of a bit of I mean, it hasn't really outperformed either, but it's one of those things that sounds like it should win from coronavirus. It sounds like it should win from a Biden administration, but maybe not, just because of some of the policies on prescription prices and things like that.
Jim, I'm going to ask you the same question. TD, obviously, you have to forecast things, and again, politically agnostic, but you got to forecast based on outcomes. What are you looking at under the scenarios that we just talked about?
Well, there's the question of the time frame that you're talking about as well. And certainly for people in the equity market, you're not just talking about the next 12 months. It's over the longer haul. What's the return on investment? How much investment is there in the economy? So those are questions that are not necessarily the same as questions for the next 12 months. And again, we touched on earlier under the Biden agenda, there are higher corporate taxes. There are potential aspects of that agenda which are not necessarily positive for business over the long run. That said, I would say for the next 12 months, pretty unambiguously, that you'll probably get more growth relatively if it's Biden. Although I'll quickly caveat that, and I'll bring up the point again earlier, that the Senate matters a lot. Frankly, even if you get Trump reelected, if it's a Democratic Senate, it's going to be a lot easier to do stimulus. Just recently, Trump has been saying he wanted to do even more than Nancy Pelosi. And again, the part holding them back is Senate Republicans. They don't want to do a $2 trillion package. So you could hypothetically get a Trump, it may be unlikely politically, but a Trump White House and a Democrat Senate, in which case you could get a big fiscal stimulus package. Alternatively, you could get a Biden White House and a still Republican Senate, in which case you can't get any stimulus out there. But having said all that, I think if we get a Biden White House, you're more likely to get a Democratic Senate as well. In that case, I would say for the next 12 months, absolutely, you're more likely to get more stimulus in the next 12 months in the Biden scenario.
Patty, I'm going to ask you this question. It's obviously loaded, but I'm going to circle back with Matt. Who wins this election? But more importantly, why do you think he wins? And I say he because there are two men obviously running right now.
I think Joe Biden wins this election. I think Matt is right in that this is a re-election, and any re-election, it is a referendum on the incumbent, and it's always and that referendum usually hinges on the answer to the quintessential question: are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And because of this pandemic, and like I said, the cascade of effects that it's having not on our economy, on our healthcare system, on our education system, that answer is a resounding no. And you see that not only in the polling nationally, but you see it in these battleground states where people are hurting, they're out of work, their kids can't go to school, which makes it impossible to work from home, all of these issues. So I think Joe Biden wins. I think he wins pretty decisively, and I think the Democrats win back the Senate.
Matt, same question to you.
So first off, and Guy, you should make the pledge. You should never talk about national polls in a presidential campaign ever again on air. So anyone that's watching this, just tune all that out. That's whatever people on the Trump campaign are doing. They have to tune out all this data that gets thrown out there that's going to inevitably be wrong. I think for the president to still win, and I do believe these battleground states, just looking at the trends in the polls at the state level and some of this absentee ballot data that I referred to earlier in this presentation, I think it is tightening. I do believe that. The path is so narrow, and I know everyone wants to have everything tied up in a neat bow, especially for the markets. I think our best chance of knowing what happens on election day is probably the next day at about 1 a.m., and that's North Carolina. And I just don't see, and I've gone through over and over, I don't see a path for the president without North Carolina. And North Carolina allows their absentee ballots to be counted early. And so by about 1 a.m., we should probably know who won on election day, which will be the president in the state of North Carolina. And we should have a really good sense of where the absentee ballot count is. So to me, if the presidential is going to be decided at the earliest point, it's going to be because of North Carolina around 1 a.m. And so I do think the president still has a shot. I don't buy into the national polls because they're meaningless. As far as the Senate, I made my prediction, but I'll make one shock prediction, and that's the state of Maine. I think that there's a chance the president could lose the state of Maine by almost 20 points. And Senator Susan Collins could still win the race. And that would be, in my opinion, the big shock of the night. She's one of the last moderates out there. There's no other human being on this planet who could put an R next to her name and still be competitive in the state of Maine right now. So that would be my shock prediction. And that would make it so much closer, again, on the Senate. And you know, I gave you my number earlier. I just think it's too early to tell because it's on the Senate. We're going to have runoffs. Just brace yourself. There will be at least one, probably two. We won't know till January 6th, which is just, in my opinion, god awful.
Jim, in the final few minutes we have here, some closing thoughts in terms of, you know, where we've been over the last 7 or 8 months and basically where you see us going through the lens, obviously, as an economist.
Yeah, well, I mean, you roll back the clock a few months ago when we saw the plunge in March and April. I mean, it was always exaggerated to start comparing it with the Great Depression because obviously a lot of that was a forced shutdown, and inevitably when those forced shutdowns ended, there was going to be some kind of a snapback. I mean, that said, I would say the numbers in general have been better than expected over the last 4 or 5 months, and we've certainly seen a good rebound. Q3 GDP this morning, we've seen 11 million jobs in 5 months. But again, the net of this is still a lot of weakness, particularly for the labor market. And the labor market is still down 11 million jobs, and disproportionately, again, it's hurting kind of those lower income, lower educated people, and it's only increased inequality from that perspective. And you might extrapolate the last couple of months and said we're off to the races. If you repeat Q3 and Q4, then we've more than made up for the weakness. But unfortunately, that's unlikely. I mean, A is COVID is not over, as we can see, and B, a lot of that came from the fiscal stimulus. And without new fiscal stimulus, that turns into a drag and you start potentially going back down again. So I think it's still a long way to go. I mean, ultimately, I think you have to credit policymakers for acting aggressively on the fiscal side earlier in the year, and the Fed as well. And it's turned this into a much softer blow. I mean, it's still a blow, but we still have a long way to go. And I think ultimately over time, there will be more stimulus, and the Fed is not going to reverse its stimulus anytime soon. So ultimately we will get back, but it's probably going to take a couple of years.
Phil, close this out here.
I mean, I kind of look at what the options markets are telling us about the election, and it kind of maybe wraps it all together. That typically once you get to election day, the volatility has been elevated. Options, their job is to price, you know, how much you're going to pay to insure against a bad market move. But as soon as the election day is over, that vol comes back down, the fear goes out of the market. We have not seen that in the forward curve this year. The options markets are forecasting probably weeks, if not months, of more of uncertainty. Obviously, some of that is coronavirus. It's a lack of confidence in terms of how long the vaccine's going to take, whether we're going to get more stimulus, but the election is a clear sort of hump in that curve as well. And so I think the options markets are saying that there's a lot of uncertainty and the election is part of that, and no one really knows for sure what's going to happen in the next 2 months.
Well, I see Adena and Joel getting ready for our next panel. Phil, I want to thank you. I want to thank, obviously, Patty. Matt, thank you. Jim, thank you. But I also want to thank the Nasdaq for allowing us to do this for the last hour. It's been great. And obviously, you have to thank our audience for spending their time with us. I know how valuable everybody's time is. I hope this answers some questions, maybe created some questions. But we had a nice dialogue, was respectful. Again, thank you, Nasdaq. And with that, I want to pass it over to Jeremy School. Jeremy?